Jonas Koch arrived in Dusseldorf with a leather folder of battle maps and a checklist of expected questions. He set the folder on the table, pressed the cassette recorder's red button, and watched its reels begin to turn. The machine's hum promised order, but the cost was immediate. The quiet magnified every click, and the old man across from him could weaponize silence as easily as any word. Karl Meyer sat with his hands folded as if they were on trial. He let Jonas ask about the Eastern Front and the winter lines, and he answered by not answering. Jonas tightened his prompts, and the result was only thicker stillness. The price of precision was that Karl's refusal looked deliberate, a refusal Jonas could not ethically cut later without turning the archive into a lie. Jonas shifted tactics and offered a softer entry, capture, transport, return, because the tape was filling with nothing but an old clock and his own voice. Karl lifted his eyes, and Jonas saw movement, not cooperation but calculation. The cost of trying to be humane was that it gave Karl a door to take control without raising his volume. When Karl finally spoke, his German was slow and clean, as if each syllable had been filed to fit a report. "You want war?" he said. "July 4th, 1943. I walked into an American dining hall." The result landed like a slap. Jonas's maps suddenly looked like props, and the cost was professional. If Jonas followed this, his standard interview would become an eccentric line of inquiry, and if he didn't, he would lose Karl entirely. Jonas attempted a small correction, the kind that preserved both dignity and schedule. He mentioned Stalingrad again and asked where Karl had served. Karl leaned forward, and the result was a threat delivered without theatrics. "If you drag me back to your questions, I stop." The cost was urgency. Jonas understood that the battle was no longer over content, but over who owned the tape. Jonas did what he had never been trained to do. He treated the interview as an active chase. He tore a slip of paper from his pad, wrote the tape's timecode, and said, "Then give me what can be checked, place, dates, any regulation number, any inspection, anything that exists outside your head." The result was that Karl's jaw tightened, not because Jonas had insulted him, but because Jonas had put a collar on the story. The cost was escalation, because cross-examining memory turned shame into a weapon. Karl answered with a detail sharp enough to cut. "Kankakee," he said. "They called it a camp, like it was temporary. It had a dining hall, like a factory." Jonas wrote the name as if it were evidence, and the result was that the room changed. Kankakee was not a mood, it was a coordinate. The cost was a promise Jonas made to himself. He would not let the tape carry claims he could not pursue, which meant he had to pursue them now, under the pressure of Karl's breath and the recorder's turning reels. Jonas asked what meal it was and what Karl saw first. Karl said he walked in expecting the economics of captivity, thin soup, counted crusts, and the result was a sudden stop in his sentence, a pause Jonas could hear as clearly as footsteps. The cost of listening was physical. Jonas felt his own stomach tighten, as if his body had begun to imitate the remembered hunger simply because Karl named it. Karl described a tray line and a stack of plates, and then the plate he was given. Meat, potatoes, vegetables, a pat of butter that shone, and absurdly, a slice of pie. Jonas forced himself to keep his pen moving, and the result was a list that sounded too generous to be true in wartime. The cost was that Jonas could already hear how easy it would be for someone later to call Karl a liar or a propagandist. Jonas asked whether it was a special occasion. Karl's lips curled, and the result was contempt aimed at Jonas's assumption that abundance required celebration. "It was July 4th, Karl said. "Their holiday. I thought it was theatre." The cost was that suspicion entered the record, and suspicion was combustible. Perfect fuel for people who wanted war to be a conspiracy instead of a machine. Jonas chased the first cattail he could see and asked how Karl knew it was not staged for one day. Karl said he did not know, and that was what made it war. The result was that Karl framed ignorance as the battlefield, where every decision was made without certainty. The cost to Jonas was procedural. An archive could store uncertainty, but it could not certify it. And Jonas would have to keep the story tethered to something harder. Karl spoke of the other men, 240 he guessed, who went silent and ate as if the hall might disappear if they looked up. Jonas asked what the silence meant, and Karl's answer made the room colder. It meant we did not trust what we were swallowing. The result was a moral inversion. Food became threat, and the cost was that Jonas felt the story pulling toward paranoia unless he pulled it back to rules and records. Jonas asked what happened after the first plate. Karl's voice tightened with a shame that had survived 55 years. When the line ended, he said, men began to hide bread, not one or two, but nearly all, tucking it into jackets, belts, socks, anywhere cloth touched skin. The result was collective theft, synchronized without orders. The cost was that Jonas now had a conflict hunger alone could not explain. Either the men expected punishment, or they expected scarcity, or they expected a trap. Jonas asked whether guards stopped them. Karl shook his head, and the result was the detail that did not fit Karl's old world. Kitchen staff saw it and did nothing. The cost was cognitive. The story demanded a new rule set, and Karl's anger at being forced to live inside it rose like heat. Jonas did not wait for philosophy. He asked about inspections and consequences. Karl said the next day there was a check, names noted, pockets searched, bread found. The result was that the act became official enough to be recorded. The cost, Karl said, was that nothing happened. No beatings, no exemplary punishment. Only a mark somewhere Jonas could not see. Jonas wrote, check, names, no punishment, and felt the recorder's hum become an enemy. The result was a decision he made in mid-sentence. He stopped treating the interview as something he would shape later and started carving it into tracks he could follow immediately. The cost was risk. Push too hard and Karl would shut down. Push too softly, and the story would evaporate. Jonas asked what regulation governed food in the camp. Karl's eyes sharpened as if the question pleased him. There was a binder in the office, Karl said, a thick American book with a label, letters and numbers Jonas caught and wrote down. AR 633-1, Karl said, and he said it like a curse. The result was an anchor Jonas could chase outside the room. The cost was that Jonas had recorded a string that, if wrong, would be used to discredit everything. Jonas asked who showed Karl the binder. Karl answered with the first role he offered without being asked. A German logistics major, older than the rest, who spoke in measurements and margins and watched the dining hall like a laboratory. The result was another thread. Someone inside the camp had already begun to translate food into numbers. The cost was that the story now carried the shadow of intelligence work, and Jonas could feel how eagerly strangers would try to stretch that shadow into a banner. Jonas looked at the cassette's spinning reels and understood that he was collecting a contested object, a tape that would soon attract hands he had not invited. The result was a tightening in his chest, and the cost was that the interview could no longer remain private craft. It was becoming a fight over interpretation. Jonas escalated the moment Karl mentioned the logistics major. He asked what the man measured and whether he wrote anything down. Karl smiled without warmth and said the major counted trays, weighed scraps, watched the garbage. The result was that Jonas could see the cat clearly now. Evidence, almost within reach. The cost was that Karl's tone implied Jonas was too late, that what mattered had already slipped away into time. Jonas pressed for the major's name, and Karl's eyes drifted to the window as if he were deciding whether Jonas deserved it. The result was a long pause, and the cost was that Jonas felt the power dynamic reset. Karl could starve him of details as effectively as any institution could starve him of support. Jonas changed the angle and asked about the body, not the paper. What the food did to men who had lived on ration logic for years. Karl's voice went flat, and he described men eating until they vomited, then eating again the next day, because their fear was stronger than their nausea. The result was brutal and specific. The cost was that Jonas flinched, because the story forced him to accept that abundance could injure as surely as hunger. Jonas asked whether anyone recorded the sickness. Karl said the medics did, line after line, stomachs, cramps, dehydration, and the result was another potential archive. Medical logs. The cost was that Jonas now carried an obligation. If he found no trace of those logs, the tape would be vulnerable, and vulnerability would invite predators. Jonas asked why the Americans did not reduce portions if men were getting sick. Karl sounded genuinely furious. Because they could afford it, he said, and the result was a claim that reclassified the war. It was not a contest of maneuvers, but of margins. The cost was that Jonas could hear, beneath the claim, the start of Karl's lifetime of shame. To admit the enemy could afford waste was to admit your own side could not afford survival. Jonas hunted the next verification point. He asked about the garbage itself, where it went, who saw it, who dumped it. Karl said he was on a labor detail, pushing bins behind the kitchen. He said he watched intact bread, meat, vegetables tipped into barrels like industrial refuse. The result was an image Karl had carried like an ulcer, food falling with a heavy wet sound. The cost was that Jonas could already hear how easily such an image could be repurposed into hatred. Jonas asked whether men tried to retrieve it. Karl said some did, and the result was punishment. Days in isolation, threats, not for stealing, but for crossing an invisible boundary the Americans enforced when it suited them. The cost was contradiction, permissive silence in the dining hall, harsh discipline behind the kitchen. Jonas asked whether the contradiction felt like strategy. Karl hesitated, and the result was the first time Jonas sensed he had forced Karl into admitting uncertainty. The cost was that uncertainty was an empty space conspiracy-minded people loved to fill. Jonas asked if the logistics major ever tried to send information home. Karl's gaze snapped back, and the result was alarm. He had not expected Jonas to go there. The cost was immediate. Karl's voice dropped, and he warned Jonas that some truths made you a target even decades later, as if the war had left behind residue that still burned. Jonas ignored the warning because the tape was running. He asked anyway. Karl said the major wrote a memorandum in German, a cold analysis of American surplus inferred from garbage and portion size. The result was desperate arithmetic, turning a dining hall into a strategic forecast. The cost was that the major tried to send it to Berlin through a channel that never arrived, and the failure haunted Karl as proof that their own system could not even carry information in time. Jonas demanded the method, how the report was sent, and Karl described whispers, a hidden note, a sympathetic guard, a chain of small betrayals. The result was a plausible route, but not a provable one. The cost was that Jonas felt the tape sliding toward legend, unless he could hook it to something stamped and dated. Jonas refused to wait. He stopped the recorder for exactly 10 seconds, wrote the time code, and picked up the telephone in Karl's presence. He called his office and requested urgently any indexing for prisoner of war camp regulations, any list of archived Red Cross inspection reports, any reference to intercepted German camp memoranda. The result was procedural violence. Jonas turned a private interview into an active investigation mid-sentence. The cost was that Karl's face darkened, as if Jonas had dragged the dining hall back under the control of institutions Karl despised. Jonas restarted the tape and said for the record that he had requested documents while Karl was speaking because he would not let the story be stolen by myth. The result was that Jonas placed his own method on trial alongside Karl's memory. The cost was that he made himself accountable, which meant any later mistake would burn his name into the archive with the same permanence as Karl's. Karl laughed, one short, dry sound, and said Jonas did not understand who would steal stories. The result was a warning that sounded at first like paranoia. The cost was that Jonas dismissed it for a moment, and that dismissal would soon become expensive. 2 days later, Jonas received an anonymous envelope at the History Society. Inside was a photocopy of a document with a German header and a few English markings, and a note in clean block letters claiming the dining hall was a feeding program designed to break German will. The result was a narrative that snapped into place with obscene ease: food as weapon, surplus as domination. The cost was immediate. Jonas realized the tape was already being hunted, and someone wanted to turn Karl's shame into a poster. Jonas went back to Karl's apartment with the recorder, the photocopy hidden in his folder, and asked whether anyone had contacted him. Karl's eyes narrowed, and the result was a small shake of the head, either denial or refusal. The cost was trust. Jonas felt it thinning like paper under flame. Jonas pressed, and Karl said a young man had come once claiming to be a student, asking about what the Americans did. The result was the first visible footprint of the predator. The cost was that Jonas now had to protect Karl as well as record him, and protection was not in his job description. Jonas asked Karl to describe the student. Karl offered only fragments: hair, posture, a smile too eager. The result was a blur. The cost was that Jonas could not hand a blur to police and expect action. Jonas returned to the only leverage he had: procedure. He told Karl that outsiders were not seeking truth. They were seeking ammunition. The result was that Karl bristled because being treated as a victim offended him. The cost was that Jonas had to risk offending him anyway, because offense was cheaper than letting the tape be cut into a weapon. Karl's voice grew harder. "Let them come," he said. "If they want war, I give them war." The result sounded like defiance. The cost was that Jonas heard exhaustion beneath it. Karl was ready to burn his own story if it meant burning someone else's illusion. Jonas left the apartment with the recorder heavier than before, and the result was a new action chain: verify, secure, preempt. The cost was that the interview was no longer only about 1943. It was about 1998 and what people still wanted from 1943. Jonas's first escalation was to seek a professional who could read paper the way the logistics major had read garbage. He reached out and found Margaret Walker, a retired American archival worker who had guided scholars through prisoner of war collections. The result was an ally on the other side of the Atlantic. The cost was humility. Jonas had to admit he was outmatched by people who knew how to counterfeit certainty. Margaret asked Jonas not for the story, but for its texture, paper grain, stamp shape, numbering style. Jonas brought the copy to a lamp and described what he saw, and the result was a list of small details that sounded boring until Margaret began to strip them for parts. The cost was that Jonas had to slow down, because haste was what forgers counted on. Margaret said real intercept summaries and camp paperwork followed patterns, and amateurs imitated the surface without understanding the bureaucracy underneath. Jonas fed her what he had, and the result was her first verdict. The document was too neat, its header inconsistent with the period, its English markings wrong in a way only someone who had never handled originals would miss. The cost was sick relief. Relief because Jonas could fight this, sickness because someone had already tried. Jonas returned to Karl with the recorder and placed the photocopy on the table. He asked whether Karl recognized it. The result was a flash of rage so quick, Jonas almost missed it. The cost was that Karl's fingers trembled, not with fear, but with the insult of seeing his life reduced to a cheap prop. Karl said the major's report had never looked like that. It had been handwritten first, then typed, with mistakes and smudges, not a polished artifact. The result undercut the forger's authority. The cost was that Karl's shame resurfaced because describing the report forced him to relive why it had mattered. Jonas used the opening to lock down a chain of custody. He asked whether Karl had kept any diary, any letter copies, any scrap with dates. Karl stared at him, and the result was another threat. "If you take my papers, you will misunderstand them." The cost was a brutal choice. Keep the papers with Karl and risk theft, or remove them and risk violation. Jonas did not plead. He offered procedure. The papers could be registered, sealed, and accessible only under controlled conditions, and Jonas would record the transfer on tape so no one could claim they had been altered. The result was a path that preserved both evidence and dignity. The cost was that it turned Karl's private life into an institutional object, precisely the kind of thing Karl had spent a lifetime resenting. Karl agreed only after Jonas stated, on tape, that Karl retained the right to be wrong and that uncertainty would be preserved rather than edited out. The result was a contract between a living man and a dead archive. The cost was that Jonas bound his own hands. He would not be allowed to clean the narrative later to make it marketable. Jonas carried the diary and cassette copies to Eva, the museum director, because museums knew how to protect objects from hands and from stories. Eva examined the package and insisted on dual registration, museum intake and archival deposit, so that a single break-in could not erase everything. The result was a wall Jonas could hide behind. The cost was that Jonas lost solitude because protection required witnesses and paperwork. The break-in happened anyway, but it happened too late. Jonas arrived at the society office one morning to find the door frame splintered and the filing cabinet pulled open like a rib cage. The result was proof that someone was hunting physical objects, not merely ideas. The cost was that Jonas's assumption of academic safety died on the floor among scattered folders. Police took notes and treated it like a common burglary, until Jonas showed them the anonymous envelope and the photocopy. The result was a shift in the officer's posture. This was not about cash, but about narrative. The cost was exposure. Once police were involved, the story could leak into newspapers, and leaks were another form of theft. A local paper ran a short item about controversial war documents, echoing the forger's phrasing. The result was reputational damage before Jonas had published anything. The cost was pressure from inside his own organization to pause and avoid politicization, which in practice meant surrendering the tape to the loudest people in the room. Jonas refused. He drafted a memo not about feelings but about evidence, time codes, recorded transfer statements, intake numbers, Margaret's assessment. The result was that Jonas shifted the dispute from ideology to procedure. The cost was that he antagonized people who wanted safety more than accuracy. Karl's health worsened that week, and Jonas visited with the recorder because time was running out. Jonas asked one last time whether Karl would speak of battles, just enough to satisfy a public hungry for gunfire. Karl looked at the recorder and said calmly that he would not give Jonas the luxury of a heroic climax. The result was the central cruelty of the tape, a war testimony that refused to perform war. The cost was that Jonas would have to defend a story built on food and shame against audiences who believed only blood counted. Karl spoke instead of the day surrender news reached the camp dining hall. A radio voice crackled, men sat with their plates, and someone, Karl never named who, laughed a dry laugh and said, "We lost, and we eat like kings." The result was a sentence that felt like a verdict. The cost was that Jonas could not romanticize it. The line was too bitter to use as decoration. Jonas asked Karl if he truly believed a dining hall decided the war. Karl answered slowly, as if choosing words that would survive him. The war was decided on farms and in factories, he said, in shipping schedules and production lines. The dining hall was merely where soldiers were forced to see the result in pounds and ounces. The result dissolved decisive moments into continuous supply. The cost was that it left no room for comforting myths, only arithmetic. Margaret sent Jonas pointers to inspection reports and cautions about how intercept material was catalogued. Jonas used her notes to plan a public clarification session at the museum because silence would allow the forger's story to harden into common knowledge. The result was a plan to fight narrative with procedure. The cost was that Jonas put his name in the open, inviting retaliation. On the day of the session, Jonas stood beside Eva under museum lights and presented not a dramatic reveal but a chain. The time the tape was made, the recorded statement of transfer, the intake numbers, the documented break-in, The reasons: the photocopy failed basic archival logic. The result was boring in the way truth often was, and that boredom was a weapon. The cost was that bored audiences drifted, and drifting audiences were vulnerable to louder lies. A man in the back, young, too clean, smiling too eagerly, accused Jonas of protecting the victors. Jonas did not argue ideology. He played Karl's voice, saying he first assumed the meal was theatre and spent months trying to prove it was not. Then he played Karl's line about farms and factories. The result was that the forger's narrative lost oxygen. Karl's shame did not sound like propaganda. The cost was that Jonas used a dying man's vulnerability in public, and even with consent, it felt like borrowing breath. Museum security asked the accuser to leave when he began filming the diary intake documents, and the result was an ugly scene that proved Jonas's point. The conflict was not about history, but about possession. The cost was that the incident would circulate in chopped clips, because chopped clips were how predators fed. Jonas filed a supplementary report with police, attaching security footage and Margaret's written assessment. The result was that the case shifted from burglary to targeted intimidation. The cost was time. Investigations moved slowly, and Karl was dying faster than any report could move. Karl died 2 months later. Jonas attended the small funeral not as family, but as custodian, and the result was embarrassment sharpened into clarity. War continued to conscript people, turning them into functions. The cost was that Jonas could not grieve cleanly because he was already thinking about catalogue numbers and preservation. After the funeral, Jonas went to the archive with the last cassette, a transcript and a statement of scope. He wrote that Karl refused to provide battle narratives, and that the refusal was itself a historical fact, a witness rejecting the story his society demanded. The result was a record that did not flatter anyone. The cost was that Jonas accepted he would be criticized for what was missing, even though the missing was the point. The deposit was approved because the procedure was solid and the chain of custody unbroken. The result was survival of the material. The cost was compromise. Jonas had to include a caution about contested interpretations, giving the liar a footnote he did not deserve in exchange for keeping the record intact. On the evening Jonas finalized the deposit, he returned alone to the interview room where it had begun. He played the first minute of the tape, listening to the clock and the button click and Karl's initial silence. The result was that the room filled again with the hum of turning reels, and Jonas felt for a moment as if the dining hall had been rebuilt inside the walls. The cost was that he knew the verdict Karl carried would never settle cleanly. Some would always want bravery to outrun bread. Jonas pressed stop. The reels slowed until they ceased, and the result was an abrupt quiet so complete it felt staged. The cost was that in the quiet, Jonas could still imagine the heavy, wet sound Karl had described, food falling into a bin, and behind it, the faint clatter of plates, repeating like a sentence no one could appeal.